This call is going to be 60 minutes starting with JR Rahn speaking with a brief presentation, then a conversation between us, and then an opportunity for your questions. If you have questions, please submit them via the chat function on your screen, and we'll take them up during the Q&A session. Please note that this is being recorded and that the recording link will be sent to all participants within a day or so, which is a good reason to sign up for future calls, even if that timing doesn't work for you. So we're incredibly privileged to be joined today by JR Rahn. JR is the co-founder and co-CEO of MindMed, a psychedelic medicine biotech company that discovers, develops, and deploys psychedelic-inspired medicines and therapies to address addiction and mental illness. JR is a former Silicon Valley tech executive who was previously at Uber, and after his own struggles with mental health and addiction in Silicon Valley, he began looking for a new treatment paradigm with the potential to solve mental health and addiction, and began personally investing in the psychedelic medicine space. He then went on to found the biotech company MindMed to focus on developing psychedelic medicines under the federally compliant FDA pathway. MindMed was the first publicly traded psychedelic medicine company to publicly list on any stock exchange and is now trading on NASDAQ. So again, JR is going to speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll come back together for a conversation followed by Q&A. JR, welcome and thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, Dick. And thank you as well for everything that you've done for the space. I think really MindMed and what we are trying to do, along with other companies like Compass and Atai, really wouldn't be here without the early philanthropy work, like with folks like yourselves, and support of some of that earlier work that really sort of became a launch pad for the entire psychedelic industry. So thank you.
Thank you.
I think really what's interesting about MindMed and what we're working on is they're very relevant topics, right? There's 40% of the country in the United States is suffering from or struggling from some form of a mental health or substance use issue. And I was one of them. I had an addiction to cocaine. I was also had a pretty heavy drinking problem and was struggling with depression and anxiety. I was probably going to die, quite frankly, and some of my friends did that were working with me at large technology companies. And about 3.5 years ago, a friend suggested that I consider psychedelic-assisted therapy. And to me, that was the craziest idea and thing that I had heard. When I heard psychedelics, I sort of equated that to Burning Man and recreational drug use. I didn't actually think that they had the potential to be medicines. And I worked with somebody in a non-compliant manner, and not in a setting that was federally legal, but ultimately realized that these substances had great potential medicinal capabilities and could be therapeutics. But we were, as a society, really misallocating our resources and our capital to treating mental health. We were really pursuing strategies that weren't working around, just looking at Xanax and SSRIs, their antidepressants that, had been propagated forward as the standard of care. But yet there was this whole new paradigm that was really, in many ways, happening in the underground of helping people and healing people. And so what I ultimately decided and believed was that we needed to have more companies that were working on psychedelic medicines to allocate capital to them in an efficient manner so that we could pursue further FDA clinical trials. And ultimately, the objective here is to get some of these psychedelic substances approved. But I think also if we just highlight after this holiday weekend, something that sort of puts this front and center for all of us, and is that mental health is a really big issue for society. But for the first time, really, that I can recollect, is now front and center in the sports world, right? You have the first withdrawal, I believe, from the French Open ever for a mental health issue. Naomi Osaka did not, break an ankle. She was dealing with a mental health issue, and Nike got right behind her in supporting her withdrawal. And I think that really demonstrates society is ready to embrace that people are suffering from mental illnesses, and we need to destigmatize mental illness as much as we need to destigmatize novel solutions that might be able to help heal people. And so this is a really, really good example coming off of this holiday weekend. I think what's also interesting to sort of be a prelude to this discussion is understanding 60% of US counties don't actually have a psychiatrist in them, right? A lot of us probably live in affluent communities where there is a psychiatrist present. And if you live in the Northeast, you're very well covered. If you live in California, you're very well covered. There's a lot of gray there in the country. And that, again, comes back to the fact that we haven't allocated capital in an efficient manner to behavioral health. And so we also lack fundamental infrastructure here to deal with some of these issues. MindMed and companies like Compass are working on drug development, but there's a whole other problem that's going to have to be solved over the next 10 to 15 years on how ultimately these drugs get deployed. And we actually establish accessible care for the entire country. And so these are things that we are thinking about at MindMed, and how we can help reimagine and re-engineer mental health care in America. I mean, this one's even more striking. So psychiatrists that specialize in addiction literally are non-existent around the country. There's a lot of gray there. And this is not good, given that if you look back to something called the rat park models, which was an earlier experiment that some of you may be familiar with, it actually took two sets of rats. They put one set of rat in isolation and another set in a little sort of social city where they could interact, and administered morphine. The rats were able to consume morphine through liquid form. The rats that were in isolation, they increased their morphine usage 18-fold compared to the rats that were in the little city. So while rats aren't exactly the same as humans, there's something behaviorally going on there. And we've just, I believe, seen the largest rat park model in human history. As we all sit in isolation, hopefully we're coming out of this relatively soon, but really for the last year and a half, we've sat in isolation. And so I think that there is going to be far greater lingering effects on addiction and mental illness after in a post-pandemic world. And that is going to linger for probably the next 10 to 20 years, the effects of COVID-19. I think the impact on mental health will probably be larger than the amount of people that died during the actual pandemic. So what's MindMed? We're really advancing these substances, psychedelics like LSD and MDMA, and novel forms of psychedelics that we're creating in labs as medicines and through an FDA pathway. We have a diversified clinical pipeline of both these classic psychedelics like LSD and these more next generation psychedelics, which we believe have probably greater opportunity in the long run. But right now, the mission of the company and MindMed is to focus on seeking an approval as quickly as possible with a classic psychedelic. And the reason we think that's a better strategy is that these substances like LSD and MDMA and others have been in millions of people before. if you talk to my chief medical officer or our chief development officer, they're less concerned with the toxicology and toxicity issues associated with these substances, and more really focused on how do we prove that they are effective in a manner that is compliant with the FDA pathway that our government and society recognizes. We have a really diverse team of both technologists and drug developers. And I think this is really, really important. If you go back and really look at what we're working on, it's as much an infrastructure problem that we're going to have to solve for as it is a drug development issue. And so we believe that from day one, we're going to need technologies to help us scale access to psychedelic-assisted therapy. When we talk about psychedelic-assisted therapy, we are talking about the key part of it is assisted therapy at the end. Psychedelics are just going to be, we believe, the catalyst for change in a patient. And sometimes, and in my own case, the integration therapy was actually more powerful, I believe, in analyzing my experience than the actual experience itself. And that's something that we cannot neglect. And there's going to be a massive need for therapists to help with integration therapy after the initial experience. And so we believe that we need to build technologies to help scale that, to actually amalgamate all these therapists, psychiatrists, and ultimately payers that are going to reimburse for these drugs over time. Just in the interest of time, I'm gonna skip over some of these slides. Our approach is to really have a diverse pipeline. There are some companies focused on a single molecule, and that could work for them. Our thesis is that in order to build up a sizable company in this space that's ultimately going to be sustainable for the long term, we need to have multiple clinical trials that sustain. And so we're going to be looking at right now 4 areas. We have an anxiety and depressive disorders program or franchise. We're looking at high doses of LSD or single doses of LSD where they would create experiential modalities. We call that Project Lucy. We also have a non-hallucinogenic molecule which is called 18MC. It's a derivative of a psychedelic called ibogaine, which we believe could maybe be a substitute for the standard of care, around methadone and other solutions that are out there for opioid addiction. And the last 2 areas that we're looking at are microdosing of LSD. There's been a lot of anecdotal evidence that microdosing may have some benefit to increase focus, and we hadn't seen enough rigorous science around microdosing, and so we wanted to conduct a commercial drug trial looking at microdoses of LSD. So we're looking in that area. And then, of course, pain is a very big problem for America, and it's in many ways interconnected with mental illness in America. There's some evidence from the 1950s that LSD was very interesting for treating pain. And so we have a thesis around that, and they're going to be disclosing more around what we'll be doing in pain, but that's our Project Angie, and really looking at how can we create a solution for pain that's not just an opioid, it's not just an analgesic, it's a massive market, it's $31 billion a year, yet the opioids are great at relieving the pain, but they create all these negative externalities on society that is not good. The opioid crisis is costing this country $500 billion a year. So definitely something worth pursuing. We really follow a process of discovering, developing, and ultimately our objective is to deploy. We're really right now in the discover and develop mode in looking at these new chemical entities and also bringing them through the FDA pathway. It's really an R&D company at this moment. We understand that eventually one day, if approved, we're going to need to deploy these medicines. And so that's where we're building technologies to make these scalable drugs. But in addition, be able to measure the outcomes, and ultimately one day we would hope be able to better predict when somebody might relapse from addiction, or someone has increased levels of anxiety, and address these problems before they can become deadly, for example. These are our clinical trials. And just a brief overview of what we're working on. The pain franchise is still in planning, but our addiction franchise is with opioid use disorder. We have a phase 1B ongoing right now in Australia, and we'll be kicking off our phase 2B for Project Lucy with single use. We're filing an IND with the FDA in Q3. And hopefully that will be accepted, and we'll move on. We've had very positive discussions with the FDA, 2 meetings so far on this program, which is very interesting to see their support for both us and other programs in the psychedelic space that are both working in the nonprofit and commercial spheres. We'll also be kicking off a microdosing study in Q4 that's happening in Europe. So that sort of really rounds out our portfolio. Dick, I think that was a good sort of introduction on what we're working on, and yeah, I'd love to just really sort of have a conversation and also open it up for Q&A at some point.
Fantastic. No, I think it was a great overview, and thank you very much. So one that just comes to mind, because I'm looking here at a timeline. When might it be before sort of you would have your first products on the market?
Well, I think, with drug development, that's always a dangerous question to answer.
I use might.
But I will answer it. I think, realistically, for one of these programs that, fully be on the market and sort of launched and ready to go, I think you're looking at anywhere from 3.5 to 5 years, right? This is a slow process. This is an R&D process, but I think what's interesting about the FDA process is it enables scalability, and that is ultimately what we're focused on. The FDA is the only way that you get a medicine approved in the United States and get it reimbursed. It's a gating item, but once you're through it, it's a great opportunity for a company, but it also enables approval in all 50 states. And I think that's really, really important, because our objective as a company is not to make these therapies accessible to a bunch of rich people on Park Avenue. That's not going to help solve the problem for 40% of the country. We need to make these therapies accessible in every disenfranchised community. And so we're going to have to get really creative on how we reimburse for that, and how we prove that these are having a benefit to society.
Great, thank you. And since it's again on the slide here in front of me, because I had received a request from someone, so I'll just ask the question here. How does one enroll in a trial? Like specifically, the question was about Angie and your pain, but how does one go about doing that?
So I think we're going to make it easier to enroll, and we get tons of inquiries. I mean, the sad truth is that we have a limited amount of space in these clinical trials, and these are massive problems that infect a lot of people. We're going to start making that information available on our website over the next few months. Okay. And so yeah, they should stay tuned to the website.
Great. So now you're running a significant public company. What was it like the early days of starting MindMed, and what was it like to do the early fundraising and before you were a NASDAQ listed company?
Well, yeah, it's been quite a change, I would say, in sentiment, even in the last sort of 12 to 18 months. But sort of early days of MindMed, I walked around Silicon Valley with a tin cup and begged people to invest at a very, very favorable valuation. I think we were trying to raise money at a $9 million valuation. That was like 2.5 years ago, and now we're a $1+ billion listed company on NASDAQ. I think the early days, people really laughed me out of the room on Sand Hill Road. This was just not, they just didn't think this was possible, that psychedelics, could be a solution for mental health. Everyone sort of just really kind of associated with Burning Man and their experiences there. And so that was really, really difficult. And I didn't actually raise all that much money from venture capitalists for this company. I raised money from people that were fed up with the system, that saw the potential, had either experienced psychedelics for themselves and had some form of healing from them. But where we really got our first big cash infusions was actually in Toronto. We had sort of realizing that I wasn't going to fund this from venture capital. I went up north to Canada because I saw that the cannabis industry had become very big, and a lot of those companies had done quite well. Similar concept, right? Schedule 1 substance that it was very fringe at the time, but the Canadians and the investors up there, had been successful with their investments. And I think really understood and believed in the story. There was still like a real battle to prove to them that this was not going to be a state-by-state legalization effort to make psychedelics work, because that was the mentality of the time 2 years ago. And I had an early board member, Bruce Linton, who was the founder of, and he was one of our initial investors. He didn't, I don't think he even totally understood that this was not going to be a legalization and lobbying business. This was really about the FDA pathway. But we convinced everybody that the FDA pathway was the right way to go. And I think now, if you look at the largest companies in the space, they're all pursuing the FDA pathway. And that is really sort of interesting and compelling, because that's how we got like the larger institutions to start coming into our financings over time, and become interested in the space, coupled with the fact that you had this massive pandemic going on and mental health became front and center. But we had lots of, early hedge funds that invested into us, big names, people that are portrayed on billions and things like that invest. But they said, if you ever pursue a recreational approach or a non-federally compliant approach, we're out and we're not going to touch you. And you're probably not going to raise much capital in the future. So you have to work within the constraints of the FDA pathway. That's the only way that our LP docs are going to allow this to happen. And so that, really, I think because we took that approach, and I think other leaders in the space took that approach, is what set us apart in the early days.
Great. So how do you think all these, particularly the single use, where it's a longer session and you need more support, how do you think all that is going to be commercialized, launched, and paid for, and made accessible? We'll combine a whole lot of things in one.
Yeah, I think that's the seminal question of the space, right? I mean, we have a lot of work ahead of us to prove that these are safe and effective drugs through the FDA pathway. That's half the battle. We also have to deal with scaling and launching these drugs, where there really isn't necessarily the infrastructure to launch them. But I think that's also part of the blue sky opportunity here, is to actually help build some of that out and create some of those systems to make these therapies scalable. In America, I was reading a statistics that something like 60% of psychiatrists don't accept insurance, flat out. And a lot of people, I don't know if MGH does it, but there are a lot of psychiatry programs that actually teach psychiatrists during their training to not accept insurance because they cannot have a viable practice if they do. And so we have this fee-for-service model in America where most of the top psychiatrists only accept cash, credit card cash, whatever it may be. But that doesn't make accessible healthcare or mental health care. And so I think you sort of hit the nail on the head, Dick. Like, this is the seminal problem to solve for. We're going to have to not only figure out how these are safe and effective drugs, but we're also going to have to recalibrate how we reimburse for behavioral health in America. The incentives are not aligned right now for these necessarily for all sort of treatments and especially therapy to being reimbursed through insurance. And so we have some innovative ideas on how we can be part of that solution. We think that value-based care is going to be a big component of proving to these health systems over time that we can, by solving for someone's mental health, can also have a massive impact on their physical health. Somebody that for example, is an alcoholic or has depression is going to be unfortunately a larger drain on the overall pie. And so I think that's also going to start with conversations with employers. They are ultimately the ones that, in this entire sort of system can look at it and try to make a rational decision. We've started to see, innovative companies like Apple and Amazon and others really drill down on how they are reimbursing for healthcare, but more importantly, in the last 12 months, really put an emphasis on mental health care. And so I think the seas of change are adrift.
Yeah, and I think that completely agree with you. And I think the great thing in particular company plans is the employers have additional incentives. They're not just concerned with like the cost of, all right, if you're on SSRIs and they're not working too well, but I don't have to spend more. There's not, and they own these employees in the sense of the employee productivity is important as well as a benefit. So I totally agree with you. Can you help people understand, terms like legalization are used, decriminalization, different states and localities are doing different things. Can you share for people both what that means and your perspective on it?
Yeah, so I think it's a really, again, relevant question, because these terms are just like so in so many ways confused. Decriminalization does not equate to legalization. I think decriminalization is a stance that using drugs or being found with drugs right now in America means that you probably face some form of jail time, right? Or some penalty from a government, or whatever government, whether that be state or federal. That doesn't really create it's not creating a great political situation. It's having massive impact on disenfranchised communities. But that's a different topic, I believe, entirely than legalization. Legalization is stating that these substances like LSD or cocaine should be freely available, and in many ways, people that sell them also don't face prison time.
Mm-hmm. What do you, as you look out 5 years, what do you think? How do you think that landscape is going to look, and what do you worry about? Some of the risks of PR or cultural backlash or commercial. What keeps you up nights?
Well, I mean,
a
lot of things keep me up at night, but I think if you look at Oregon, for example, right, which everyone probably read in the New York Times and Wall Street Journal, that psychedelics are being legalized in Oregon. And many people saw that as a very positive thing. And I do think it is positive. I think it is positive that people voted and said, look, we're fed up with a mental health care system that's not working. And we clearly need to make a change. just because it's legalized in Oregon doesn't mean that somebody in Texas or North Dakota is going to be able to access those same medicines. And so what we as a company are thinking about is, how do we do this in a scalable manner, right? Like, how do we actually have all 50 states? And how do we find a way to reimburse for this and not just make this, in Oregon for folks to access and actually maybe not in the disenfranchised communities there. I think a lot of things, still need to be decided about Oregon and how that works. My biggest fear is that there's a backlash against Oregon as the first state. And that creates enough drama on all the good that we've done to destigmatize psychedelics in the last 10 years, and the work that Rick Doblin has done at MAPS, and just the whole industry that has now sprouted up from all these efforts. And the FDA sees all this, and we have some senator come along and just say, we got to shut all this down, and they try to pass a law to really shut down psychedelic research. And that would be terrible. And so I think that's something that as an industry and as a community, we really need to think about. There really is a way to get a medicine approved in the United States, and everyone seems to use the FDA pathway. I don't necessarily think that psychedelics should be different if you're actually focused on treating mental health with these substances. And that is our mission. We're focused on treating mental health. We are not focused on your Fish concert, your Burning Man, experience. I don't care about that. What we care about is that 40% of the country is suffering from mental illness and addiction right now.
We are getting a lot of great questions, and I'll be asking those. So if you have questions, please use the chat function, and please put them in there. Sometimes I'm integrating several of them together just to make it easier. What are some of the areas for scientific exploration that are most exciting to you?
In psychedelics specifically, or in general?
Well, I think psychedelics and mental health. we can talk about extraplanetary possibilities.
Yeah, they just found fungus on Mars. I think that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, very interesting.
Look, I think from a early science point of view, I think that these are vast, untapped areas because traditional pharma companies just didn't look at these substances, right? And so there's so little known about maybe some of the analogs of, for example, LSD or mescaline or MDMA. And can we discover new forms of psychedelics that might have a better therapeutic profile? I think that's going to take time, because what's interesting about the FDA process thus far is they've, for the classic psychedelics like MDMA and LSD, they really allowed us to leverage some of the academic studies and clinical trials, which is not necessarily always granted when you're developing a drug. And so it's going, when you think about these NCEs or these novel psychedelics, they're 8 to 10 years away from maybe ever getting an approval. That's a long investment horizon. That doesn't mean that we should not be working on them, but I think they need to be part of eventually as a part of a broader portfolio. But there's going to be, and my bet is that there's, we're doing great work on novel psychedelics. There's I think a bunch of private companies that are out there that are going to be working on discovering novel psychedelics, and that is going to be really, really compelling and interesting for companies like MindMed, Compass, and others as we advance.
So gotten a few questions. The positive side of being a public company CEO is the ability to raise capital and to do all this. The downside or shadow side, is that what you do becomes that much more public. So there were just a couple of questions related to stock sales, and I figured I'd give you an opportunity to address that.
Yeah, completely. Look, I think as an entrepreneur, we go through many things, and I've many struggles to get to be a $1 billion listed NASDAQ company, right? There were years of credit card debt and just periods where I wasn't making a whole heck of a lot. And so when you do have wins, I think you sometimes need to realize them from a risk perspective. That doesn't mean that you're because you're selling stock means you're out of the game. Very much, this is a personal mission for me. I'm doing this because I was personally affected by these substances and feel that they have a role to play in treating mental health. But at the same time, my financial advisors say you got to de-risk a little bit here. And I think every CEO of all the sort of major listed psychedelics companies have de-risked in some manner. I know, for example, Compass has done that. And so it's a logical thing to do. And that's why I did it.
Which, makes total sense. The whole, having some diversification, but I did want to ask it because people were submitting that. Another question, there's a lot of conversation about IP strategy and versus open science and et cetera. Can you sort of comment on, to the extent you're able to, on kind of your IP strategy and if you have any comments on open science?
I think, open science, could have some merits. But in reality, if it's a true invention, then we believe as a company, true invention should be covered. We're investing, shareholders' resources. People have put their hard-earned money into making this company viable. We should protect that for our shareholders, and we will do that. That doesn't mean that we're going to troll the space and patent things that shouldn't be patented. I don't really think any company's intent is to create unnecessary patent trolling of psychedelics. I know the debate around open science versus protecting IP. I think there is a need for IP in society. It allows for capital to be allocated in an efficient manner, and we are going to protect our IP. Yes.
Great. Can you talk a little bit? Again, it's melding several questions here, but about, I guess I'd make it two parts. One is related to the training of therapists or clinicians in these studies. And then the second would be the approach of, Lucy versus flow, for example, where one is very therapist intensive, and the other therapist might be a useful adjunct, but aren't part of the process itself.
Yeah. So training of therapists, let's be clear. When we talk about building infrastructure, we're really talking about scaling humans, and humans are difficult to scale. Therapists will be the rate limiting factor in this entire space, and I think the work that you're doing at MGH and other programs like it are very, very important work, right? And it has to happen because nobody's going to be able to prescribe these medicines over time if we don't have that necessary therapist infrastructure in place. So our thinking is that will, in this, Dick, might be a way that we might also find ways to collaborate with MGH is we think that technologies are ultimately going to really enable training, but they're also going to enable the scalability of therapist networks and amalgamating those therapist networks. But at the end of the day, somebody's got to prescribe the medication. And we ultimately believe that a psychiatrist is going to be best at prescribing these medicines. And the problem we have in America is I think there's 38,000 psychiatrists in the United States, and they're not physically in a lot of the places where people need the help the most. Like, for example, the states that are hardest hit by the opioid crisis, they're gray boxes on that map. So we're going to have to figure out a system or platform that allows for what we believe a psychiatrist sitting at New York City to prescribe these medicines, maybe even supervise the treatment from a distance, but have trained therapists or potentially EMTs or nurses that are actually administering the therapy in person, because the human connection is very, very important, we believe, through this process. But we're not going to build a whole new industry on the back end of 38,000 psychiatrists. You cannot do in-person psychiatry for psychedelic assisted therapy. It's not going to happen. So that, I think, answers the question about Project Lucy on sort of our broader vision, is that creating technologies that enable that scalability and remote administration of psychedelics are going to be widely important to furthering the entire field. And those are the things that my CTO, Bradford Cross, who was an early engineer at Google, and early pioneer of machine learning, are thinking about. But it's not only just the therapy session that we're thinking about there. It's like, how do we track the outcome over time, right? How do we track the integration therapy to actually demonstrate that that's having efficacy through real world data? That's going to be really, really important. And I think, putting them in a full stack solution, I'm a technology guy, this just makes sense. But it's an afterthought for most drug development companies, right? Like, if you look at, there really hasn't been many successful drug development companies and biotechs out there that have gotten technology right. And so I wanted to integrate that into our DNA from day one. I thought it was really important to do that. Yes, when we look at, for example, Project Flow microdosing, probably less of a need, to have therapists involved, maybe as an adjunct, but probably not part of, necessarily a protocol. And we're still in early days there, I think, on microdosing, but I think there probably is some form of a companion app and tracking, again, outcomes and having more data. Like, we have very, very little data about how medicines prove efficacy in the United States. And it's something that I think you need to start from the drug's launch. It cannot be like sort of a tack on afterthought. And they need to sort of, in many ways, be developed in unison. I mean, you might not put all that in a clinical trial because it would complicate the clinical trial, but having those adjuncts are going to be really, really important.
Are you looking at all at biometric devices to sort of measure health outcomes?
Definitely. I mean, there's a massive trend, right? Like, if you just look at various rings and blood monitoring devices and bands, which one is that? I can't see it from.
I've also worked with Aura, but anyway.
Got it. That's going to be big, but I think, again, it comes down to, those are pieces of hardware that need to be integrated into a comprehensive platform. That's a data collecting tool. What you do with that data to improve the standard of care is going to be extremely important. And I don't think anyone's totally cracked that yet. It's a tough problem to solve on how you harmonize all that data and make it applicable. Real world data definitely has applications. And this is something that our chief medical officer, Dan Carlin, was working at Pfizer. He headed up the digital therapeutics division at Pfizer. So definitely things we're thinking about.
Great. So a question here about the IP strategy around the two LSD products, as the molecule itself is open domain and the use cases are, may be considered not novel.
Around which particular?
I guess it'd be Lucy and Flow.
Yeah. Look, I think there are going to be ways to establish patentability around not necessarily the composition of matter, and maybe not necessarily even the use case, but how these are being dosed, in what manner they're being dosed. We have a very strong IP position, and are working hard towards that. But again, I think the interesting thing about IP is you don't always disclose exactly how you're approaching it. We will not be filing composition of matter patents on LSD. That is not in our intent.
All right, thank you. So just Can you elaborate on your findings related to bipolar?
Findings related to bipolar. I don't believe we're doing anything in bipolar disorder right now. I think actually there's probably bipolar is, I think, of exclusion criteria. I believe on the protocol that we're developing. I need to double check on it, but no, we're not doing anything bipolar disorder.
Okay. So, what do you see as the biggest opportunities outside of MindMed for investment or philanthropy in this space? What's missing?
Well, I think you're working on one of the biggest ones, right? Which is we need to train therapists. The entire space needs to do that. It's not just companies, right? Like we need infrastructure. There's a lot of gray on that map, and that map is talking about psychiatrists, but really the front lines of this are therapists. We just simply can't. Like even if we doubled the amount of psychiatrists over the next 5 years, which would be a very, very hard task, we need to figure out ways to make this care more accessible. And so training is going to be definitely a place for both philanthropy and investment, I believe, on building out that infrastructure. I also think that there's going to be some very interesting novel psychedelics and medicines, maybe some of them hallucinogenic, maybe some of them non-hallucinogenic, that come out of the allocation of capital towards psychedelics. And so discovery would be another place I would definitely place a bet.
All right. What about secondary effects of microdosing? Is there any data related to that? And I'll just embellish on it. There isn't a whole lot that has been done adequately studying microdosing. So any thoughts or comments on that?
Well, I think that's part of the opportunity we saw was specifically with LSD. There was a trend. There was a clear societal trend or micro trend in Silicon Valley, right? That people were getting off their Adderall and microdosing LSD, sometimes a couple times a week, and sometimes no times a week. And so there isn't enough data to tell us microdosing, actually works to increase focus or increase these flow states. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence that points us in the right directions. And so we actually have two studies. We have one academic study and we have one commercial study around microdosing. And I hope that we have a lot more data to talk about when I come back here in a year and a half and 2 years to say, hey, look, actually, we found this very interesting data out about microdosing. But for me to opine on this right now, it would be imprudent because we don't have enough data. That's the fact.
A question came in here. Can you talk a bit about MindMed's support for NYU and more broadly, how you think the role of philanthropy will or won't change with the advent of the rapidly growing commercial infrastructure ecosystem?
Well, it's always been a mission of MindMed that we're really working as impact capitalists, right? This is not necessarily philanthropy. I believe that a lot of great change can come from the ability to allocate capital in an efficient manner. And so that's what we are going to focus on. But we also have made donations to NYU, as an example, one of the other rate limiting factors in this space is that a lot of the academics that have been studying psychedelics over the last 10 years are filled up. Like the amount of clinical trials that can happen in the academic realm, there's not enough researchers out there. And so that was part of what we're looking at NYU is to grow the researcher base, because if we're going to grow this as a field of medicine, we're going to need more academic researchers.
Completely agree, and thank you for the great work you're doing there. A question which is not MindMed specific, but you're in this space and unfortunately have had to live through it. What do you think can be done to help prevent addictions in the first place?
Well, you know, preventing addiction is, I think that's a very complex question to deal with, to unpack there. I think in order to address addiction, you need to deal with the underlying issues that certainly for me were around childhood trauma. And so in my own experience, you know, I lost my mother when I was 8 years old, when our family was on vacation in the Dominican Republic. And I lived with the guilt of my mother for most of my childhood and adult life. And I didn't really deal with it and realize why I was drinking, why I was consuming cocaine to numb a lot of the pain that I was feeling and the guilt I was feeling, until I had a psychedelic experience. You know, I discovered my mother dead at the age of 8, and she was reading my sister and I a book, and I just thought she was falling asleep. I didn't think she was having a heart attack, and didn't really go and find anyone for 20 minutes. And I lived with that for a lot of my life, thinking that I caused the death of my mother. And so if you're talking about treating addiction, there's always something that I think is underlying why somebody is consuming. And then there's obviously some chemical imbalances that come about over time. But there's always some, I believe, form of a trauma. And so I think you have to deal with those underlying causes. And somebody has to be willing and ready to deal with them too. I mean, you can't force somebody into trying to heal those underlying traumas. So I had to get to the point where it made sense for me to deal with it.
Yeah. Wow, that's tough to deal with. A question around political and policy issues. Have you been involved, and do you have any thoughts or comments about work that's being done, not on decrim and not on alternatives to FDA, but things like enhancing research? Governor Rick Perry, former Secretary of Energy under President Trump, just recently helped spearheaded in Texas, you know, support for research. Any thoughts or comments on that?
So the question is around political support for research and
but political engagement, not decriminalization, which you've talked about, but
yeah. So I think the one topic in America right now where we can probably all get on the same path and get people from both sides of the aisle to agree on is that our mental health is not in a great state, and we need better solutions for treating it. And so if that happens through political engagement, great. You know, I think that I actually had a brief telco with Rick Barry before he announced that, and I was really, you know, it gave me hope, like that, you know, we can have support on both sides of the aisle, and that's really, really important. But I think we got to monitor it closely.
Sure. Are you going out? What are you doing?
I'm going upstairs.
Okay.
And the noise was coming through, but
Barry, can you make sure everybody else is muted, please? Thank you.
So what I was saying was, it's important to have that engagement. I also, in some ways, fear it. The FDA process, in many ways, is very apolitical. You're really looking at if something is safe and effective. Again, I think some of the things that are going on the legalization efforts are positive. I mean, it demonstrates that people want change for mental health. I just hope it doesn't affect all the efforts of both philanthropists and this overall new and nascent industry.
Fantastic. Thank you. We're approaching the top of the hour here. If there was one thought you wanted to make sure people left this call with, what might that be?
I think it's that, you know, psychedelic medicines and psychedelic assisted therapy are solving a problem in society, and that is that we're looking at how do we redefine and re-engineer our mental health care system, right? That is why there's been capital, I believe, allocated in the last 12 months. It's not just going to be psychedelics. These are not panaceas for everything. They can be catalysts, and they need to be treated as catalysts to re-engineer mental health care in America.
That's a really important message. So thank you so much. Before concluding our call, I'd like to invite the audience, if you're a YPO member or spouse and interested in staying informed and learning more on the topics, please join the YPO Psychedelic Medicine for Mental Health group for discussion boards and resource sharing. Also, I want to thank JR Rahn for joining us today and for all your sharing your time, your very personal experience, as well as all the incredible work you're doing and the effort to get these potentially very powerful medicines destigmatized and advanced to help alleviate the suffering of millions around the world. So we're deeply grateful. And as a final reminder, this recording will be available and circulated in about a day or so. This call series will be taking a break over the summer because people get busy with things, but look forward to reconnecting with people in the fall. So JR, thank you so much for what you're doing, for your words of wisdom here, and for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Sure. And thank you everyone for joining. Have a great day.